The first time they called him Scrap Heap, Cale Draven laughed so hard his drink spilled across the bar. The laugh wasn't cheerful. It was the kind of laugh that made even the barkeep pause, because behind it was the sound of a man who had already buried too many enemies and a few too many friends. The mercenaries thought they were mocking a cripple. They didn't realize they were poking at a predator that was pretending to sleep. One particularly bold alien leaned forward, sneered at Cale's mechanical arm, and called him the demon who forgot how to kill. That was when Cale's eyes lit red for the first time in years, and the cantina turned so quiet that even the humming generators outside seemed to hold their breath. Cale took a slow sip from the glass, though most of the drink had already escaped across the counter, and leaned back in his chair. He looked like the picture of ruin. His right arm was metal, the plating dented and scratched as if it had fought one too many battles and refused polish. A brace hugged his left knee, whirring faintly every time he shifted. His face bore scars that ran like rivers into the stubble on his jaw. Nothing about him screamed threat anymore, and perhaps that was why the mercenaries felt so brave. They were young, reckless, and certain the galaxy belonged to them. They didn't know his name, not really. They had only heard fragments of old stories about a soldier who had once been called the War Demon. To them, it sounded like drunken legend. The bar filled with their laughter. They mocked the limp when he rose from his seat, the way his frame creaked when he stretched. One alien clutched its chest, pretending to collapse, wailing about old bones and broken soldiers. Another asked loudly if the demon wanted a walking stick with a laser sight. Cale shook his head and muttered something about comedians always dying young. The mercenaries didn't hear him. Or maybe they did and just didn't care. Yet beneath the laughter and jeers, there was a tension in the room. The barkeep knew Cale. So did a few older patrons scattered among the tables. They had seen what those red eyes had meant once upon a time. They had heard whispers of the campaigns, the sieges, the planets that fell quiet after Cale had passed through. They had watched men who thought themselves immortal walk into battle at his side, only to be left in the shadow of something greater and far more terrifying. Those patrons stayed quiet. They let the young mockers dig their own graves with every joke. Cale sat again, staring at his reflection in the drink. The face looking back wasn't the same one the galaxy had feared. It was older, heavier with regrets. His scars weren't medals but debts unpaid. His mechanical parts weren't trophies of survival but reminders of how close he had come to losing everything. He hated that reflection as much as he hated the laughter behind him. But he said nothing. Not yet. Outside, the galaxy was stirring again. Rumors whispered through the trade routes, stories of a warlord uniting the scattered alien clans. His name was Vrykos, a brutal strategist who had risen from the ashes of forgotten battles. The younger mercenaries toasted him at the same table where they mocked Cale. They called Vrykos the storm that would wipe the galaxy clean of weak bloodlines. They had no idea that Vrykos was the very name that haunted Cale's nightmares. The warlord had been there at the breaking of the demon, the battle that left Cale half metal and half memory. The Galactic Council announced through every broadcast tower that they were preparing new defenses. They spoke of alliances, fleets, and strategies, their words painted with the confidence of bureaucrats who had never seen the inside of a trench. The mercenaries cheered the coming storm, drunk on the idea of profit and conquest. To them, Cale was nothing more than a broken relic watching history move without him. One of them leaned across the table, his teeth glinting in the low light. He jabbed a finger at Cale's chest plate. "Tell us, old demon," he said. "How did it feel to be forgotten?" Cale looked up slowly, his gaze locking onto the mercenary's grin. He almost smiled himself, though it was thin and cold. "Forgotten," he repeated softly. The word hung in the air, strange and heavy. The laughter faltered for a moment. Cale stood again, his frame unfolding with the creaks of metal and bone. He limped past them toward the exit, saying nothing more. The mercenaries let their laughter return, though it was quieter this time, as though part of them wondered if they had gone too far. The barkeep shook his head and muttered that fools always played with fire until it burned them. On the dusty street outside, Cale looked toward the stars. He could almost hear the drums of war echoing in the void. He had told himself for years that he was finished, that he had nothing left to give. But the galaxy was cruel, and peace was always temporary. Somewhere out there, Vrykos was gathering his legions. Somewhere out there, the storm was brewing. And somewhere inside him, despite the limp, despite the scars, despite the machines bolted into his flesh, the war demon was waiting to wake. When Cale returned to his small quarters, the walls were lined with relics of a life he tried to forget. A helmet with a dent through the visor. A blade scorched black. A tattered flag from a regiment that no longer existed. He sat in silence, staring at those ghosts. The laughter from the cantina still rang in his ears, but underneath it he could hear something else. He could hear the cries of old battles, the roar of engines, the crack of weapons fire. He could hear the voice of Vrykos as clearly as he had on that day so many years ago, mocking him as he bled out in the dirt. Cale closed his eyes and whispered to himself that he would not return, that he was done. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew he was lying. Because when the storm came, it would not care for his promises. When the storm came, it would drag him back into the fire whether he wanted it or not. And when that happened, the mercenaries who laughed at him would learn why broken men should never be mocked. The first sign of the betrayal of peace came in the form of smoke rising over the horizon. At first it looked like another trader's ship had crash-landed in the dust plains beyond the outposts, nothing unusual in a sector where engines sputtered as often as hearts. But then the alarms shrieked across the settlement, a sound that had not echoed in years. The mercenaries who once spent their nights drinking and jeering at Cale scrambled for their weapons, suddenly sober. It was not a crash. It was a raid. The sky darkened as ships descended, sleek and jagged, marked with the banners of Vrykos. The warlord was testing his strength, flexing his arm against those too small to matter. The outpost had no fleet, no fortifications, only a scattering of militia and veterans who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. Cale stood in the street watching civilians scatter like frightened birds. Mothers clutched their children, traders abandoned their carts, and the same mercenaries who had mocked him only days before shouted orders no one listened to. Cale turned to walk away. This was not his fight. He had already lost enough in wars that promised peace but delivered only graves. He muttered that fools could play hero if they wished. But then his gaze fell upon a boy huddled near the market stalls, the same boy Cale had spent idle evenings teaching card tricks to. The child's eyes widened in terror as an alien warrior advanced, blade gleaming in the dust-filled air. Cale felt something deep in his chest twist. He could ignore the mercenaries, he could ignore the council broadcasts, he could even ignore the laughter that had dug under his skin. But he could not ignore the look of a child about to die. The alien warrior raised its weapon, grinning at the easy prey. Then its grin faltered. The child was no longer alone. Cale stood between them, his mechanical arm humming as it locked into place. The warrior sneered, thinking it would earn glory by slaying a cripple. It lunged, fast and vicious. Cale moved faster. His metal arm caught the blade, sparks flying. With a twist and a grunt, he yanked the weapon free and slammed his fist into the alien's chest. The impact echoed like thunder. The warrior flew backward, crashing into the dirt, its armor crumpled like tin. The street fell silent for a moment. Civilians stared. Mercenaries froze. The child clung to Cale's leg, eyes wide with awe. Cale himself stood breathing heavily, not from strain but from the sudden rush of memory. His body remembered. His instincts remembered. And the monster they called the war demon was stirring. More raiders surged forward, shrieking in alien tongues. Cale's eyes burned red as they had in the cantina, and he let out a growl that sounded too feral to be human. He charged. What followed was not a battle but a dismantling. Every movement was precise, every strike meant to kill or cripple. He used his mechanical arm as both shield and weapon, crushing skulls and snapping limbs. He fought with a brutality that left even the mercenaries staring in horror. One raider had its throat torn open by the jagged plating of his knee brace. Another was hurled headfirst into a wall, its bones shattering like glass. By the time the last one fell gasping into the dust, the street was painted in silence broken only by the hiss of smoke and the hum of Cale's machinery. The survivors among the raiders scrambled back to their ships, shouting in panic. The words carried across the street and into the ears of everyone listening. They said only one thing: "The war demon lives." The phrase rippled through the outpost like a storm, whispered by lips that had only days ago laughed at his limp. Cale stood over the wreckage, his chest heaving, his eyes still burning. The child peeked from behind his leg, trembling but safe. Cale knelt and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice softer now. "Run to your mother." The boy nodded and fled, casting one last look at him as if he had just witnessed a legend come alive. In the aftermath, the emissaries of the Galactic Council arrived. Their ships gleamed clean and polished, a stark contrast to the soot-covered buildings and blood-stained streets. They bowed deeply before Cale, their words polished with desperation. They begged him to return, to lead once more. They spoke of Rykos, of the armies uniting, of battles to come that only the war demon could win. They promised him command, resources, even redemption. Cale laughed, a dry and bitter sound. "Redemption," he said. "You think that's what I'm after?" He turned his back on them, limping toward his quarters. The emissaries pleaded, insisting the galaxy needed him. Cale spat that the galaxy had needed him once before, and it had paid him back with scars and silence. He would not bleed for it again. But then they said the name. Vrykos. The warlord himself was uniting the clans, the same warlord who had broken Cale's body and left him half dead years ago. The moment the name crossed their lips, Cale stopped walking. His fists clenched. His metal arm whirred with tension. Memories slammed into him, the voice of Vrykos laughing as Cale lay bleeding in the dirt, the mocking words about demons who could be caged. Cale turned back slowly, his face dark, his voice low. "If Vrykos is coming, then this war is not about the galaxy. It is about him and me." The emissaries seized the moment, declaring that fate itself demanded Cale's return. He silenced them with a glare. Fate had nothing to do with it. This was vengeance. This was unfinished war. He told them to gather their soldiers, their fleets, their resources, but to understand one thing. He would not fight as their savior. He would not fight as their general. He would fight as what he had always been: a demon. Cale never liked the idea of teaching. Training recruits was a chore he used to leave to lieutenants and drill sergeants, men who enjoyed barking until their voices cracked. Yet now he stood in front of a ragtag group of soldiers and misfits, most of them barely old enough to shave or still carrying the smell of spilled ale from the cantina where they used to mock him. They looked at him with mixed expressions, half fear and half disbelief, as if they could not decide whether to call him commander or cripple. Cale broke the silence by slamming his metal fist against the crate, the echo sharp and cruel. "Lesson 1, he said. "You are all idiots, and if you stay idiots, you will die." The first days of training were chaos. Cale had no patience for formality, no interest in lining men up to march in perfect rows. He cared only for survival. He made them run until their legs buckled, fight until their knuckles bled, and think while exhausted until their brains screamed. He pointed out flaws with insults sharp enough to sting more than any strike. One recruit tried to argue back, mocking Cale's limp. Cale floored him with a single blow and then helped him back up, growling that learning sometimes came with broken teeth. Even the aliens in the group, proud warriors of clans that had once despised humans, found themselves ground down under his relentless gaze. By the end of the first week, their laughter had been replaced by quiet respect laced with fear. At night, when the recruits collapsed into sleep, Cale wandered alone. His quarters were filled with relics, and his mind was filled with ghosts. He saw the faces of men and women who had followed him once, comrades who had believed in his promise of survival. He saw them screaming in the flames of old battles, falling under enemy fire, their voices lost forever. Sometimes he would wake in a cold sweat, clutching the edge of the bunk until his metal fingers dented the frame. The nightmares whispered to him, reminding him why he pushed the recruits so hard. He would not let them die like the others. He could not bear more ghosts. The recruits began to notice the cracks in him. They saw the way his eyes grew distant when silence felt too heavy. They heard him muttering names they did not recognize. Yet they also saw the steel in his methods. Every exercise, every cruel demand had a purpose. He forced them to fight blindfolded, to crawl through simulated minefields, to fight each other in teams where betrayal was rewarded as often as loyalty. His lessons were brutal, but they learned. They stopped being individuals and began to form something that resembled a unit. He called them the brigade, though the recruits often whispered a different name when they thought he was not listening. They called themselves the Demon's Brigade, and even though they meant it half as a joke, the name carried a weight that stiffened their spines. Their first real test came sooner than anyone expected. Intelligence reported that Vriko's forces were moving a weapons convoy through a nearby sector. The convoy was heavily guarded, filled with munitions that could level cities if they reached their destination. The council wanted a fleet attack, something large and loud. Kale shook his head. A frontal assault would be suicide. He told them he would take his recruits. The council laughed at the thought of a handful of misfits striking a convoy guarded by hundreds. Kale did not laugh. He said only one thing. You asked for the war demon? You do not get to question the methods. The plan was reckless. They would infiltrate under the cover of asteroid shadows, board the lead ship, and sabotage the convoy from within. If it worked, the entire chain of ships would collapse in on itself. If it failed, none of them would live long enough to regret it. The recruits whispered about suicide missions, but Kale silenced them with the same phrase he always used. Survival is earned, not given. The mission began with silence. The brigade crept through the dark in stolen transports, engines powered low to avoid detection. Kale moved at the front, eyes fixed on the target, every muscle taut with purpose. The closer they drew, the calmer he became. The recruits, however, grew more nervous. He could hear their breaths in the comms, quick and shallow. He told them to hold it together, reminding them that fear was nothing more than energy misplaced. Put it in your trigger finger and stop wasting it in your lungs, he said. They boarded the lead ship with frightening ease. Too easy, Kale thought. Still, they pushed forward, planting charges along fuel lines, seizing control of communication relays. The recruits moved with precision Kale had drilled into them, silent and sharp. For a brief moment, pride flickered in him. Perhaps they were not fools after all. But then the alarms screamed. Doors slammed shut around them. Lights flared red. The trap was sprung. Enemy soldiers poured in from every side, armed and ready. Kale cursed under his breath, realizing they had been allowed aboard. This was bait, designed not to lose a convoy but to test the resolve of the war demon. The recruits froze, fear threatening to undo everything. Kale's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Fight or die. Those are the only choices you've ever had. The brigade fought with desperation, their training snapping into place. Blades clashed, plasma fire ripped through the corridors, and screams echoed in the tight metal halls. Kale moved like a storm, his metal arm crushing and tearing, his every strike a lesson in brutality. The recruits followed his lead, carving through enemies with the determination of those who had been broken and rebuilt. They planted the final charge just as Kale dragged the last enemy soldier to the ground with a roar. The explosion tore through the convoy, chain reactions ripping ship after ship apart. Flames blossomed in the void, a spectacle visible even from the distant outpost. The brigade barely escaped in their transports, the heat of destruction chasing them until the stars swallowed the fire behind them. They had won. Against all odds, they had won. Yet as the recruits cheered, Kale sat silent. His eyes were narrowed, his jaw clenched. He knew this victory was not theirs. It had been handed to them by Vrikos. The warlord had wanted him to act, had wanted him to gather soldiers and show his hand. The convoy was bait, and Kale had bitten. He looked around at the faces of his brigade, their cheers ringing with pride and relief. He felt the weight of what was coming. They thought themselves warriors now, ready for war. Kale knew better. The true storm had not yet begun, and when it did, He wondered how many of them would survive long enough to see its end. Cale sat in silence while the transmission played across every broadcast in the sector. The alien commanders had taken his image from the convoy ambush, twisted and amplified until his scars looked grotesque and his limp exaggerated into comedy. They laughed as they spoke his name, calling him the washed-up relic of a bygone war. The so-called war demon limps now, one alien jeered in the broadcast. No claws, no teeth, no terror left in him. Just a husk clinging to broken metal. The message spread like wildfire, broadcast to every outpost and fleet. It was not just meant to taunt him. It was meant to poison the morale of those who followed him. His recruits, who had begun to wear the name Demon's Brigade with pride, now sat in silence as the mocking laughter of their enemies filled the airwaves. Cale watched them carefully. He saw the doubt creeping into their faces, the way their shoulders sagged, the way some avoided his eyes. The galaxy was laughing at their commander, and the laughter was heavier than any blade. He could have tried to reassure them, could have spoken words about reputation meaning nothing. But he knew speeches did not silence fear. Fear was silenced only by action. So he stood, his voice steady and sharp, and told them that if the galaxy thought the demon had no teeth, then it was time to remind them how deep those teeth could bite. The chance came sooner than expected. Intelligence revealed a supply depot where Vriko's forces stockpiled weapons and fuel. Taking it out would cripple enemy movement in the sector. Cale's instincts told him something was wrong. The location was too obvious, the defenses strangely light on paper. He knew it was bait. But he also knew that not acting would sink his recruits deeper into doubt. So he made his decision. They would strike, but on his terms. The brigade moved under cover of darkness, their ships silent in the void. They landed on the barren moon that housed the depot, its surface cracked and lifeless. The facility loomed ahead, guarded but not heavily. Too easy again, Cale thought. He ordered his soldiers to spread out, to move with caution, to prepare for the worst. They crept through the shadows, disabling patrols, planting charges, and preparing for what looked to be a flawless strike. For a moment, hope flickered among the recruits. Perhaps this mission would be as successful as the convoy raid. Then the alarms wailed. Floodlights flared, blinding and merciless. From the craters around them, enemy soldiers rose like shadows given flesh. Dozens, then hundreds, armed and waiting. The depot had never been a target. It had been a lure. Cale cursed himself for leading his soldiers into the trap he had expected all along. The recruits froze, terror choking their movements. Cale did not flinch. His voice roared over the comms. Hold the line. Fight as I taught you. Earn your survival. The battle was chaos. Plasma fire lit the night sky, explosions thundered across the cracked surface, and screams filled the air. The recruits fought with everything Cale had drilled into them, but the enemy numbers were overwhelming. The brigade's line bent under the assault, soldiers falling one after another. Cale waded into the thickest of it, his metal arms smashing through armor, his blade tearing down warriors twice his size. He fought like a man who had no right to still stand, and for a while, that fury held the line together. But fury could not stop inevitability. The brigade was being crushed. Cale knew they could not hold much longer. He signaled the order to retreat, shouting for his soldiers to fall back to the transports. They obeyed reluctantly, some dragging wounded comrades, others firing blindly to cover the retreat. Cale stayed at the rear, holding the enemy at bay with raw violence. The ground shook with the force of his strikes, the air filled with the metallic roar of his voice as he carved a path for his soldiers to escape. They made it out, but not all of them. One of Cale's closest trainees, a young soldier named Joran, who had shown more grit than most, turned back when he saw Cale cornered by a wave of enemy troops. Joran fought like a madman, cutting down enemies to reach him. Together they broke free, but in the final moment, Joran threw himself in front of a plasma blast meant for Cale. The impact seared through him, and he collapsed with a smile that seemed almost defiant. Cale caught him as he fell, but Joran was gone before he could say a word. The brigade returned to the outposts broken and bleeding, their numbers slashed, their morale shattered. The recruits who survived turned on Kale in fury. They accused him of leading them into a slaughter, of caring nothing for their lives. Their voices cracked with grief and rage as they demanded to know if this was all part of his plan. Kale listened in silence, his expression grim. When their anger boiled over, he finally spoke. "I am not your savior," he said. "I am not here to protect you. I am here to turn you into something the enemy fears more than death itself. If you want comfort, find it in prayer. If you want survival, follow me." His words silenced them, though not with reassurance. They looked at him differently now, not as a commander but as a figure they could neither love nor hate, only fear and obey. Some muttered that perhaps the aliens were right, that their leader was no hero but a monster dragging them into hell. Kale did not argue. He told them the truth. "I am your demon," he said. "And demons do not play fair." The revelation hit them harder than the battle itself. Some accepted it, seeing in his ruthlessness the only chance of surviving the war. Others recoiled, whispering doubts into the shadows. It was in those shadows that betrayal grew. Kale did not know it yet, but among his brigade was a spy, one who had been feeding information to Vrykos all along. The warlord had no need to guess at Kale's movements. He had eyes and ears within the demon's brigade itself. As Kale sat alone that night, staring at the dent his metal fist had left in the wall during his rage, he could feel the noose tightening. The galaxy was laughing at him, the enemy was baiting him, and his own soldiers were beginning to fracture. He closed his eyes and whispered the same promise he had made since the day Vrykos had broken him. The warlord would pay. But as the night deepened, Kale wondered just how much of himself he would have to lose before the payment was made in full. The night the spy revealed himself was the night Kale remembered what true pain felt like. It began with whispers, muttered doubts among the brigade, voices questioning his command and his sanity. Kale dismissed most of it as the natural aftermath of loss, the grief that always twisted itself into anger. But when the attacks grew sharper and the details of their mission seemed to be anticipated by the enemy too perfectly, he knew the rot had spread deeper than frustration. He began to watch his recruits in silence, his gaze narrowing, his instincts gnawing at him. It was only a matter of time before the knife was drawn. The blade struck in the dead of night. Kale had been alone in his quarters, patching the servos of his mechanical arm, when the door hissed open and one of his own soldiers stepped inside. He recognized her instantly. Talia, sharp-eyed and quick-witted, the one who had always asked questions just slightly too precise. She moved fast, no hesitation, her blade flashing in the dim light. Kale turned, but not quickly enough. The blade tore into his side, searing hot and merciless. He staggered, his arm clattering against the wall as sparks flew from his brace. Talia smiled coldly, no longer pretending. "Vrykos sends his regards," she whispered, twisting the blade before Kale slammed his mechanical fist into her chest and hurled her across the room. Pain seared through him, but pain was an old companion. It reminded him that he was alive, that his body still had fight in it. Blood poured from his wound, but his eyes flared red and his voice rumbled with something more than anger. "Now you have reminded me what pain feels like," he said, his words carrying a weight that made Talia falter. They fought savagely, his strikes heavy and unrelenting, her movements quick and desperate. She was skilled, trained to kill him, but she was not prepared for what it meant to face the war demon in close quarters. Kale's metal arm caught her wrist, bones snapping as she screamed. He slammed her to the ground, pinning her with one knee and snarling as he held her own blade to her throat. For a moment, the room was filled only with their ragged breaths. Kale's wound burned, his body trembled, but he did not kill her. Instead, he dragged her before the brigade the next morning, bleeding and furious. The soldiers gathered, eyes wide as they saw the traitor revealed. Some gasped, others cursed, and a few looked away in shame, realizing they had doubted Kale while unknowingly sheltering a spy. Kale stood tall despite his bandaged side, his voice carrying over the silence. "This is what betrayal looks like," he told them. "She was one of you. She laughed with you, trained with you, and then sold your lives to Vrykos. Do not ever think the enemy waits outside the walls. The enemy always finds a way inside. He did not execute her quickly. Instead, he gave her a choice. Die cleanly or die screaming. Talia spat at him, and so he made her death a warning. The brigade watched in silence, some horrified, some grimly approving, as Cale's methods reminded them that mercy was not something demons gave. When it was done, he turned to them, his voice dark and steady. Fear me. Hate me. But follow me. Because I will drag you through hell and back, and you will live long enough to spit on your enemies' graves. The words cut through the brigade like fire. Some shivered, some clenched their fists, but none turned away. They had begun to understand what it meant to follow Cale. He was not a savior. He was not a man who promised safety. He was a force that would teach them to survive, even if survival cost pieces of their souls. The moment broke something in them but also forged something new. They no longer looked to him for comfort. They looked to him for the brutality that gave them a chance to live. With their trust rekindled in a darker form, Cale began to plan what he called the Demon's Gambit. It was a mission no sane commander would attempt, and perhaps that was why it would work. Vriko's flagship was the heart of his fleet, a fortress bristling with weapons and shielded by legions of ships. To strike at it directly was suicide. Cale's plan was to lead his brigade in a suicidal infiltration, tearing into the flagship from within and cutting off the head of the beast. The council called it madness. Cale called it necessary. Preparation for the mission was grueling. The brigade drilled in silence, their laughter long gone, their movements sharp and focused. Cale pushed them harder than ever, ignoring his own wound, ignoring the blood that still seeped through his bandages. He moved with a kind of grim energy that fed off the pain, every step reminding him of the debt he owed Vrikos. The recruits began to mirror his intensity, their eyes hardening, their voices growing cold. They were becoming something more than soldiers. They were becoming demons in their own right. When the day of the mission came, Cale stood before them, his armor scarred, his mechanical arm humming with lethal promise. He looked at each face, seeing fear buried deep beneath the hardened expressions. He told them the truth. This mission will kill most of you. It may kill all of you. But if we succeed, the galaxy will remember this night until the stars burn out. And if we fail, then at least we will fail so loudly that Vrikos will never forget who made him bleed. They launched into the void, their transports darting through enemy lines with reckless precision. The flagship loomed ahead, a leviathan of steel and fire, bristling with weapons that could tear worlds apart. As they closed in, enemy fighters swarmed, plasma fire streaking across the darkness. Cale led from the front, his ship weaving through the chaos, his voice calm and steady over the calms. Hold the course. Remember what we are. They breached the flagship's hull with a thunderous explosion, tearing through corridors filled with smoke and alarms. The brigade spilled inside, weapons blazing, cutting down defenders with ruthless efficiency. Cale charged at the front, a monster reborn, his mechanical arms smashing doors and crushing enemies, his blade carving a path of destruction. He mocked alien leaders even as he gutted them, his voice filled with dark humor that unsettled his own soldiers as much as it terrified the enemy. The corridors became a storm of blood and fire, the brigade fighting with the fury of those who knew death waited at every turn. Cale thrived in the chaos, every strike a reminder of the demon the galaxy had once feared. The broken veteran was gone. In his place was something far more dangerous, a man who had embraced the monster within. And as the flagship shook under the weight of their assault, Cale knew the final reckoning was near. The flagship trembled like a wounded beast as Cale and the brigade tore through its innards. Smoke choked the corridors, alarms shrieked in every direction, and the enemy scrambled to contain the chaos. The soldiers of Vrikos fought with desperation, but fear bled into their eyes when they saw Cale. The broken veteran they had mocked was gone. What stood before them was the war demon, every scar and machine part turned into a weapon. Cale moved with savage purpose, cutting down anyone in his path, his red eyes glowing like fire in the darkness. He led his soldiers deeper into the heart of the ship, where the throne chamber of the warlord awaited. The brigade fought like demons themselves, but every step forward cost blood. Men and women Cale had trained fell screaming in the halls, cut down by plasma fire or crushed under collapsing bulkheads. Still the survivors pressed on, driven not by hope but by the sheer gravity of Cale's presence. He never slowed, never faltered, even as his own wound burned and his body groaned beneath the strain. He would reach Vrykos, no matter the cost. The warlord had haunted his nightmares for too long. Tonight those nightmares would bleed. When they finally breached the throne chamber, the air itself seemed to tremble. The room was vast, lined with banners of alien clans, the walls studded with weapons and trophies taken from 100 conquered worlds. At the center stood Vrykos, towering and monstrous, his armor black as obsidian, his weapons glinting with the cruel edge of a conqueror. His eyes burned with cold amusement as he watched Cale approach. "So the cripple crawls back to me," Vrykos said, his voice booming across the chamber. "I wondered if the galaxy's jokes about you were true. A demon reduced to a limping relic." He laughed, the sound deep and cruel. Cale said nothing. He simply dropped the broken blade he carried, flexed his mechanical arm until it whirred with power, and stepped forward. The soldiers of Vrykos moved to block his path, but the warlord raised a hand. "No," he commanded. "This one is mine." The battle that followed was nothing like the skirmishes in the corridors. This was personal, brutal, and filled with a hatred that spanned years. Vrykos struck first, his massive blade crashing against Cale's arm with a force that rattled the floor. Cale countered with savage precision, every move born not of elegance but of survival. Metal clashed against metal, sparks showered the air, and each strike was a memory of the past reborn. Vrykos mocked him with every blow. "You limp slower than before. Your arm groans like a rusted hinge. Is this the demon who once terrified my armies?" Cale's response was to slam his knee brace into Vrykos' thigh, the jagged plating tearing through armor. The warlord roared in pain, stumbling back. Cale growled through blood and sweat. "Every scar you left me is a weapon now. You should have killed me when you had the chance." The fight raged across the chamber, their bodies slamming into pillars, shattering stone and steel. Vrykos was stronger, his strikes heavier, but Cale was faster in the ways that mattered. He used his broken parts as traps, feints that baited the warlord into overconfidence. His limp made Vrykos underestimate his speed. His damaged arm seemed weak until it clamped like a vice around Vrykos' wrist, crushing bone. Every weakness had become a weapon, every scar a reminder that Cale was a man who could not be destroyed. The brigade fought on the edges of the chamber, holding off waves of reinforcements as they watched their commander wage war with their enemy's god. Some shouted encouragement, others fought in silence, but all of them knew that the outcome of this duel would decide everything. If Cale fell, they were finished. If he won, the galaxy would never laugh at his name again. Finally, after what felt like hours, Cale drove Vrykos to his knees. His mechanical arm locked around the warlord's throat, his blade poised to end it. The brigade shouted for him to finish it, to cut the monster down once and for all. Vrykos glared up at him, still defiant even in defeat, spitting blood and laughter. "Do it, demon," he growled. "Prove that all you are is a butcher." Cale froze. His soldiers' voices rang in his ears, demanding vengeance, demanding closure. Yet something inside him stirred, something that had been buried beneath the rage for years. "Death is mercy," he said slowly, his voice dark and steady. "And demons do not give mercy." He released his grip, slamming Vrykos to the floor instead of ending him. The warlord lay broken, alive but ruined, forced to live with the shame of defeat. The decision shocked everyone, even Cale himself. The impact rippled across the enemy ranks. The alien armies that had once rallied around Vrykos' strength now saw their leader crawling on the floor, humiliated and shattered. Their morale broke like glass. Soldiers dropped their weapons, fleets scattered into the void, and the great warlord's empire collapsed in a single moment of dishonor. The brigade held their ground, watching as the enemy fled in waves, leaving their commander standing over the fallen warlord like a shadow given flesh. When the battle was over, silence fell. The flagship smoldered around them, corridors burning, bodies littering the ground. The brigade gathered, bloodied and exhausted, staring at Cale. Some looked at him with awe, others with unease, but all of them knew one thing. The war demon had returned. The broken veteran they once mocked had become a legend again, not because he had killed his enemy, but because he had shown the galaxy that demons choose their own rules. Cale did not bask in the victory. He gave no speech, no celebration. He turned away from the fallen warlord, his limp heavier than before, his wound seeping through the bandages. He ordered the brigade to retreat, to live, to carry the memory of what they had done. When the transports lifted away from the crumbling flagship, the outpost children who had once watched him with wide eyes would one day hear the stories. They would not laugh. They would whisper the truth. Back at the outpost, Cale walked alone through the streets. Civilians stared at him with a mixture of fear and reverence. The mercenaries who once mocked him lowered their eyes as he passed. And when he reached the small square where the child he had once saved stood waiting, the boy raised his hand in a salute. Cale paused, the corners of his scarred mouth twitching into something that almost resembled a smile. The galaxy would tell stories for generations about the night the war demon rose again. They would speak of fire and vengeance, of armies shattered and empires humbled. But Cale knew the truth. He was still broken, still haunted, still human beneath the machine and scars. Yet in that brokenness was a power that could not be mocked. The war was over, for now, and Cale walked away not as a hero, not as a savior, but as the demon the galaxy had learned to fear once more.